Well, it's a great pleasure to be back at Godrej. I think last time I was here is in 2017 when we came to India. I was at the United Nations and we did the first consultation on the United Nations LGBTQ plus standards of conduct for companies. And then we came back in 2018 to launch it, and that's when we took this picture with Keshav Suri and my co-author, Salil Tripathi, Nisa Godrej. And it was kind of meaningful. The standard said that companies had responsibilities when it came to the rights of LGBTQ plus people, and that they should take action to ensure that they had fair access to the workplace and that they had also an equal experience. So today I'm back to speak about a completely different topic, which is board diversity. But please do indulge me for a minute as I'm going to take a little bit of a tangent. So in 2018, after I left India, shortly after I left India, I went to Milan and also to launch the standards of conduct. Milan is kind of the economic center, as you know, in Italy. And so while I was there, I went to Gucci, which is that luxury brand, part of the Kering Group, in the suburbs of Milan, and I met with the very famous CEO of the brand, Marco Bizzarri, who I think has been CEO of Gucci since 2015. So when I'm meeting Marco Bizzarri, I remember we had a discussion about standards, and I talked to him about the concept of flocking, right? This idea that human beings love to gravitate towards those with whom they have things in common. And I said, well, look, I'm a French gay single dad, and when I feel the most at ease is when I'm surrounded by gay men. It's even better if they're French. It's even better if they are dads, right? That we have a lot in common, and I feel at ease. And I remember that he turned to me and he said, well, that's funny, because I feel my best when I'm surrounded by people that are different. And I immediately responded to him and I said, well, that's why I'm a tiny civil servant at the United Nations and you're the CEO of Gucci. And that's a bit of a joke, but we kind of all know intuitively that the most interesting moment we have is usually with people that are different from us, people that do not hold the same opinion. It's when we travel to foreign countries. That's where the wealth of life is, but that's also when the best outcome happen. And so, I'll tell you another thing, which is also a personal story, that during the pandemic, I get fed up of living in New York City in a tiny apartment with two little kids that were not in school. So I moved to Connecticut in August 2020, and as I was in the process of moving, I remember that I had lived all of my life in what I would describe as gay ghettos, right? All of my adult life, I lived either in Dupont Circle, which is the gayest neighborhood in Washington, D.C. I lived in Hell's Kitchen in New York, another very gay neighborhood. And it was kind of the first time that I would live in a straight place where maybe I would even be the only gay in the village, because gay people tend to not really live in rural areas in the United States, right? They tend to go to places where they are comfortable. So I went there, and it wasn't the easiest for me. In fact, I often felt slightly irrelevant. But in retrospect, I came back after a year and a half to New York, and I actually went to live in a straight neighborhood, the Upper West Side. And in retrospect, very often, I think it was one of the most interesting and marking experience I had, And to be frank, I kind of lost a little bit of fear of straight people that I always had, in particular, a fear of straight men. And the reason I say that is that this combined to the Gucci story I told earlier, I feel that to me, it kind of stamped in that conviction that the most interesting life happens when you confront your fear of difference and of other people. So that's relevant to the boardroom because the boardroom is an extremely homogeneous setting. And in fact, for a very long time, it was mostly composed of white men, to the point that it was very difficult to diversify them in the United States. And in France, as an example, in 2010, the regulator had to come in and to say, well, look, you have to have 20% women by 2014, and which later will turn into 40% women, and that's not discussable, which actually led France to have 44% representation women. And the board itself has been, in retrospect, grateful that the regulator stepped in, because it acknowledged that the discussions are more interesting, that the decisions might be less consensual, but they are better, and that the CEO and the management team is rightly controlled by the board. And then similarly, boards that are diverse tend to be better at assessing risks that are coming down the pipeline. Now, as I mentioned, France has 44% women, but the United States is probably closer to 29% because it doesn't have quotas. And then I think in India, we're talking about 18% or maybe 19% of the board of companies are held by women. And that's a big issue. There is systematic reasons why it's more difficult to diversify boards than, say, rank and file employees or middle management. And the reason is that very often positions are filled word of mouth, right? The CEO, the board members suggest names. Those are the names that are being, considered, and eventually those are the names that are being appointed. But I think there is another aspect which is kind of crucial, is that trust is extremely important. First of all, it's kind of difficult to get rid of a board member when they are appointed, but also, it's a fiduciary function. So trust is crucial. And sometimes, members of underrepresented group, African Americans in the United States or ethnic minorities all over the world, women, LGBTQ plus people are perceived as not trustworthy. And it's really often linked to very old stereotypes, right? As an example, if you take gay, lesbian, bisexual, and trans people, they are constantly considered as breaking social norms. And if you break social norms, you might not be a trustworthy person, right? And then similarly, I think that gay men are also considered as probably frivolous, but also as weak, right? A lot of the narrative around HIV/AIDS was gay men are diseased, gay men are weak, right? And so those are creating real bottlenecks to diversification. However, there is now in the United States kind of a game changer, which is that NASDAQ, the second largest stock exchange in the United States, has required from its member companies that it disclose its board composition. And their narrative has been, well, look, it's not about pushing a woke agenda of like, oh, let's put more gay people and red hair and, strange being in the boardroom. The narrative is that it is not only leading to improved governance, and indeed now there's a scientific body of evidence that boards, are exercising better control when they are not homogeneous. But it is also about strengthening the market integrity and improving investor confidence. And that, I think, is a very important question, right? Is that investors want to know that the board is not the old boys club, right? Which is friends helping each other and basically not asking hard questions, collecting their money and going the other direction. And there is a good reason for that, which is that companies have had very public downfall. think about Enron or think about, Terranos and Elizabeth Holmes, right? I just saw that Elizabeth Holmes is now heading to jail. Very often investors have been asking, what was the board doing? And so it has led to much more scrutiny about how people are being appointed to the board. So since August, all of those NASDAQ-listed companies have to disclose who is sitting on their board, including whether gay, lesbian, bisexual, and trans people have a seat. And that has led to some kind of a conversation about LGBTQ plus people on corporate boards. So here's a graph that shows you, on one hand, in light yellow, how people are represented in the American population. And in darker yellow, like orange, it tells you how much board seats there are. So, white people are representing less than 58% of the American population, yet they have more than 80% of the seats. African American have much less seats than they represent in the population. And then similarly, you can see that Latino are one of the most underrepresented group, right? In fact, I think that in California, if I remember well, they represent 40% of the population and they have 2 to 3% of board seats, right? LGBTQ plus people is even worse. Right? My assessment is that out of 5,670 seats on Fortune 500 companies, we occupy 34 seats, right? And 27 people are basically out in the boardroom, right? Some of them are very well known. Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, Jim Fitterling, the CEO of Dow Chemicals, Beth Ford, the CEO of Nandolex. Some of them are prominent LGBTQ plus people in business, but it's an incredibly small group. In fact, we're talking about 0.6% of board seats. So, I'm a one-trick pony. When I was at the World Bank, I worked a lot on inclusion of LGBT people in development. At the UN, I work on the inclusion of LGBTQ plus people in rank and file employees and globally. And now I just created the Association of LGBTQ plus corporate directors. And in fact, our friends in Canada created even sooner. Just created a new chapter called the Association of LGBTQ plus Canadian corporate directors. So what our association does is that, it does a little bit of advocacy, trying to dispel the myths around LGBTQ plus people. But more importantly, what it does is that it connects LGBTQ plus people to other LGBTQ plus people in the boardroom to try to palliate to the fact that very often they are excluded from existing network. I love to make that joke that very often board members, particularly for big publicly listed company, are tapped because they vacation in Martha's Vineyard, or are tapped because they are on the professional golf association, right? And very often LGBT people are not there, exactly for the reason I described earlier, right? Which is I didn't really want to live in Connecticut because I felt it was going to be uncomfortable, and I am myself guilty of flocking, which is spending time with people that are exactly like me. So this slide is actually presenting exactly what I said earlier, right? Which is LGBTQ plus people now in the American population are estimated at 7.1%, which is really high, right? Unfortunately, they only have 0.8% of the CEO seats in Fortune 500, 4 seats. But it's even less when you look at the boardroom. We're talking about 0.6% of the seats. So here is the matrix that NASDAQ has mandated its company to disclose. And now that we're in the middle of proxy season 2023, we can see that in their proxy statements, American companies have indeed asked their board member whether they are LGBT. And so for the first time, we have a pretty clear benchmark in the boardroom, and we are going to use it to track progress. Now, public boards, meaning publicly listed companies, is only a small percentage of boards, right? There is an entire world of private boards that we pretty much don't know anything about, besides preliminary evidence that the situation might be even worse in this. So my philosophy is lead with the talent, which is, instead of saying, well, look, here's an LGBT person, why don't you put them on your board? What I say is, look, this is an exceptional individual that has exactly the skills that you need, right? Maybe it's a CFO that worked for a company that brought a drug to market, right? But very relevant to what you're trying to do. And by the way, they happen to be LGBT, so they will bring the necessary diversity to your board. And that's a long-term battle. I think that that this tend to be gradual change. There is a good reason for that, which is that usually the tenure on the board is pretty long, meaning there is not always mandate terms, right? And so it means that it might take some time to achieve like reasonable numbers when it comes to LGBT representation in the boardroom. So here is a good example of what the association does. It first of all, it's building a network, and I think that's probably the most important service that we can do. Concretely, what we do is that we organize dinner where LGBT people in the governance space can meet each other, but we also connect LGBTQ plus people to each other, but also to people that are in the board, straight allies, right? Because there are a lot of straight people in the board that are convinced that it would be better if there were LGBTQ plus people. So we also prepare candidates for board service, and I think that's very important, right? Which is that if you do not have a role model that has been on the board, you probably do not know which skills you need to acquire, but also which narrative you need to create in order to get on the radar screen of board. And so, what we do is we do webinars, we do reports, and then we raise awareness, right? Which is still an important part, right? Which is making the case for why LGBTQ plus inclusion matter to the boardroom, right? I think because people tend to flock together, there are still a lot of people that are skeptic as to whether indeed LGBT people represent a sizable segment of the population, whether indeed investors, consumers, and employees are paying attention to levels of inclusion. So, it's also, I think, important to make the case. So before I conclude, what I would love to say is, how is that relevant to India, right? I think that, first of all, India is also on a journey to inclusion. Right? Decriminalization is probably the first step into economic inclusion for LGBTQ plus people, right? If you're a criminal, it might be difficult for you to get a job, right? But I think that India has kind of a particular trajectory in the sense that social acceptance is actually pretty high. And there are a lot now of LGBTQ plus people that are visible. I mean, I came here in 2012 for the first time, and it was a taboo topic. Right now, brands are resolutely on the side of LGBTQ plus people. So I think that the demand for LGBT representation in the boardroom is definitely coming towards India. I think that the second lesson is also to start having a deeper look at what are the bottlenecks to diverse boards. And indeed, would company perform better if at least women would have some level of representation that is above 20%, right? I mean, in 2023, having less than 20% women representation is kind of worrying. But also, the question for all of us is, how can we look at board service as possibly part of our career, right? And what are the things that we can do now to position ourselves for board service in the future? And that means, acquiring some level of governance knowledge, maybe even serving on a non-profit board to gain some of that knowledge. But there's also a lot of posturing, right? People that have chief in their title tend to be in high demand. And then similarly, sometimes developing particular expertise, right? So we know that knowledge of cybersecurity or artificial intelligence is now in high demand for the board seat. So look, you know, I'm really happy I had the opportunity to have this conversation with you. You know, and it also gives me the opportunity to get more South Asian friends because, as I mentioned, you know, I tend to be surrounded by Western white gay guys, and that makes life pretty boring after a while. And on this note, I thank you very much for listening to my presentation.